The opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers nor Rogers TV.
Hello, and welcome to Politically Speaking, Insights and Issues. I'm your host, Dave Szollosy. One of the wonderful perks of being able to host this show on Rogers TV is the opportunity to meet and speak with a lot of interesting people. Today's guest is a fine example of that. Dr. Maria Paez Victor is a sociologist, born in Venezuela, educated in Caracas, New York, Mexico City, England, and Canada. She has 20 years of national and international experience in policy analysis and environmental assessment. She's an author of a recently released book, Liberty or Death, and is a person who is in constant contact with family, friends, associates in Venezuela. You are aware right now of a particular crisis going on in that country, and the world's attention turned to that. This opportunity to speak with Dr. Victor will allow us to unpack a lot of the messages we're getting and to understand the context of the conversation around Venezuela. Dr. Victor, thank you so much for coming up tonight. It's a real pleasure to meet you.
No, I'm quite honored that you asked me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you. To start us off, can you give us an overview first of what is happening in Venezuela right now?
Okay, the first thing to know about Venezuela is that it is sitting on the largest reserve of petroleum in the world. It has more petroleum than Saudi Arabia. If Venezuela grew bananas only or potatoes, nobody would care what is happening there. So what you are seeing right now is a move by the United States and its allies to get their hands on that petroleum resource. The second thing that is happening there is that Venezuela has a government for the last 20 years that decided to be sovereign, that decided that it was the Venezuelans who should decide what their politics should be, what their future should be.
And that started with the election of Hugo Chavez?
Of Hugo Chavez. He was elected in 1999, in December 1999. And he sadly, of course, passed away, and President Maduro was elected, and he has recently been re-elected for his second term on May of last year. And so the United States, which has always treated Latin America as their backyard, has a whole history from 1900 to now of about 75 military or other interventions, of assassinations, of destabilizing, of backing every single tyrant and dictator in the region and opposing every single progressive or reformist leader, has taken exception to this and wants to make sure that this uppity government, this uppity Venezuela, is put in the right and follow the dictates of the United States of America and its allies. So there are two things: the fight for the resources, and not just oil. Venezuela is one of the world leaders in gold, and also coltan, which is used for phones and electronics, diamonds, water. The natural resources of Venezuela are immense. And so the United States and their corporations and their allies want to control this natural resources. And second of all, they do not want to see any kind of strong government in Latin America that would assert itself in saying, we really want to carry out the will of our people, and we want to determine our own destiny. Because Latin America, since the Monroe Doctrine, is supposed to be for the Americans, which means for the United States.
The wealth that you talk about that Venezuela is in possession of, the oil wealth in particular, but also the precious minerals like coltan, diamonds, etc., would present a framework where Venezuela should be a very, very prosperous country for the people. And I think, in fact, under the initial years, under Hugo Chavez, that it was progressing very well, but there has fallen into collapse. The economy is the accusation of collapse. Very often now we're hearing it being blamed on, the socialist administration can't administer the country. But hasn't Venezuela been the object of a lot of sanctions and economic sabotage?
Well, two things. They did a recent study, I think it's called Fairview, of 800 articles written about Venezuela in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. 800 in this last, let's say, 8 or 9 years. And only 3 of them mentioned the social programs, and did so dismissively. Why? Because Venezuela, with the money from the petroleum, invested it in its people. This is a tenet of the Bolivarian government, that the wealth of Venezuela should be put into an investment, social investment for the people. So Venezuela now has a fine public health system. There is a doctor in practically every village. Education is free, from a full daycare, national daycare, to university is free. 2/3 of the country is studying. There is no more illiteracy in Venezuela. The UN has certified that Venezuela cut poverty to 1/3. That that
1/3 of its previous levels. Is that what you mean?
Sorry, yes. And that the extreme poverty went from 13% to 5%. So this was an immense sort of decrease of poverty in Venezuela. When Hugo Chavez became president, 80% of the people of Venezuela, of this rich Venezuela, was in poverty. Why? Because the elite who governed for 40 years, what did they do with that money but put it in their own pockets? I mean, this is basically what happened. The elite that governed Venezuela for the 40 years before President Chavez squandered or stole the equivalent of 15 Marshall Plans. You know, the Marshall Plan.
That's the United States applied to Europe, after World War II.
When it was
money
destroyed.
they spent. Yeah.
Okay? So they gave 15 of the amount of that.
Rebuilding, reconstituting Europe.
15
times
of those
that
went into the pockets of the very same people who now are in opposition and yell that Maduro is a dictator. This is an elite, a very prosperous, a very wealthy, very well-connected elite.
Would we call them like the 1%?
Yes. Yes, I would say even less than 1%. You could see this in the when they were marching on the streets in 2014. The opposition came out against Maduro, and it's funny because someone said in Venezuela, it's very funny. It's the rich who come out on the streets to protest, and it's the poor who are on the side of the government. And you saw them in their Nike shoes and their little water bottles and their nice little hats, you know, which they gave out in kits so that they could go out and protest to this government. So this opposition in Venezuela, there are many parties. What is sad is that the most extreme of those parties, the most extreme party of the opposition in Venezuela, is the one that is being backed by the United States and Canada and the EU.
And that's the party of which this self-proclaimed president,
yes.
Guaido, is the leader of.
Voluntad Popular. the leader of Voluntad Popular is not Guaidó.
Popular unity, I guess.
Yes,
Translate, that's what we translate?
The popular will.
Popular will, right.
It is run by Leopoldo López, who's in jail because of his because he was filmed inciting the mob to commit terrible acts and
of violence.
And there was a trial. He had all the lawyers in the world. He is the son of one of the richest, most traditional families in Venezuela. And the other leader of Voluntad Popular is Maria Corina Machado, who is often invited into Canada. She is the daughter of two of the most richest families in Venezuela. And these two creatures were responsible for the deaths of 114 people, the burning of 20 people, and the burning alive of two young men in 2014. And these are acts of terrorism here, there, and anywhere in the world. And yet these are the people that are being recognized by Canada and the United States and the EU.
I want to shift a little bit in this segment, because the word dictator has been thrown around an awful lot to describe Maduro and that government. So let's talk about those disputed elections, if we can, because at the core, that's at the core of these claims. He's a dictator. Now, he was recently reelected, you mentioned, and he was after his initial election. But Guaido never ran for anything, right?
No.
So where is the claim that these elections are invalid?
Well, the claim is in Washington, because these elections have never been questioned in Venezuela. It's not true that the opposition did not take part in these elections. There were 16 opposition parties, and they were backing 4 opposition candidates. And Maduro got 6.3 million, 67% of the votes. The second person got about almost 2 million votes, Henry Falcón, and the third person, Bertucci, got about 900,000 votes. These people who lost never questioned the legitimacy of the elections. They never went before the authorities and said, you know, there was fraud or this is not right. No one questioned this. We had over 150 international observers from all over the world watching these elections, and they came out with reports. There's a report from the Canadian delegation, a lot of that was sent there by the unions and such, and all of the reports said these elections were clear. Why are they doing this? Well, it so happens that Venezuela's elections was studied by Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter. He has studied 90. He has gone and watched 90 elections in the world. And he said the Venezuelan electoral system is the best in the world because it's practically fraud-proof. It is electronic, but also you have to put your thumbprint on it. So there's the fingerprint, and then you get a piece of paper that just that certifies what the electronics is saying. So it's a sort of a double to make sure that what you voted is correct. Furthermore,
the voter gets that, or the clerk gets that?
The voter gets it, and the clerk gets it. So then, afterwards, more than almost 3/4 of all the ballots are counted in front of the opposition members and in front of the observers, just to make sure. So there was no fraud. There can't be a fraud. It's not like a box that you can put in, you know, pieces of paper. It wasn't contested by the opposition. The opposition took part. Why are they saying that it isn't? Because the 3 parties that were in cahoots with the United States decided we won't take part in these elections so that we can then...
And we're going to have to finish that back up when we come back from break. Stay with us, please. We're talking about Venezuela on Rogers TV. Thank you very much. This is good. Hi, welcome back to Politically Speaking, Insights and Issues. Thanks for staying with us. I'm Dave Szollosy, your host, and I'm talking with Dr. Paez Victor, who's a Venezuelan professor, and we're talking about the situation in Venezuela. One of the issues surrounding the accusations of dictatorship in the country has to do with control of the media. And that's a charge you hear levied around that there's no free information available. How accurate is that depiction of the Venezuelan media?
Well, it's very funny because when the Lima group just met last week in Ottawa, they would not let Telesur in. So let's talk about
You might have to explain who Telesur is.
Telesur is the TV station of most of the countries of Latin America, based in Ecuador. And so all the TV stations of those countries do Telesur, a very fine news, news station. Well, I wish that President Maduro controlled the media. I would love to see that. In fact, 95% of the media in Venezuela is in private hands. These are the TV stations, which there are about 4 private TV stations, and a plethora of radio stations. I don't know how many. The government has 1 TV station, and it has, I think, about 2 radio stations, perhaps 3. So these radio stations and TV stations can say and do say whatever they like. There is no censorship in Venezuela. There is not, pass me what you're going to see so that the government can watch this. Nothing. There is, and I invite anybody who's listening to me, go to Venezuela, turn on the TV, and you will see that the opposition and people who don't like the government are free to say whatever they like.
Well, I mean, the fact that you've got an opposition leader going around the country calling for a coup by the Venezuelan army speaks to me of how much freedom of speech there is in the country.
Yes. Well, when President Chavez was confronted with this...
this is the former president.
The former president was confronted with this lie that he was muscling the media. What he did was he got a program whereby neighborhoods, small towns, villages, a township like this one could get a TV station, get the cameras and everything, and they could have community radios. So now in Venezuela, there are over 300 community radios, and they are not run by the government. These are technologies that are given to the community, and the community has the full freedom to put on there whatever they like. And I have been to many of these community radios, and I can tell you the creativity and the wonder of them are fantastic. And
as a sociologist, you'd have a particular insight into the impact of those, how that responds in the community too.
The TVs, the private TVs, love to put on what are called soap operas. And I remember a person from, a humble person telling me, yes, in the soap operas that we used to watch, the bad guy was always looking like us, was always a dark person. Or the servant was always the one who looked at us. But the hero or the heroine, she was always white. And now on these TVs and on these radio stations, they write their own programs. They write their own poetry and songs, their own little soap operas. They write it themselves, and they feel this reflects what we are, rather than this elitist private TV that still exists down there and that is highly biased towards the upper classes.
So let's go back to the...
There isn't any censorship in Venezuela.
So let's go back to the original question we were posing, what we're talking about. Why is the United States engaging in leading an imperialistic struggle against Venezuela? And I'm wondering, is it too simplistic to simply say it's about the oil?
It is a neo-colonial war against not just Venezuela, but we heard Trump, but against the continent.
You're talking about the South American continent?
Yes, the Latin American continent.
Latin American community.
From the Rio Grande down. This is Mr. Trump that wants to put a wall so that the rapists, the criminals, the murderers from Mexico and Central America won't enter their country. These are all canards. These are all lies that he says. And so now he wants to destroy the Venezuelan government, who... the Venezuelan government isn't actually socialist. It wants to be socialist. But for a country to become socialist, many other things have to happen. But that's what they would like to do. So Venezuela, Cuba is socialist, and Nicaragua, again, is on the road to socialism like Venezuela. And Trump has declared in an absolutely atrocious speech 2 days ago that he wants to eradicate socialism in this continent. I mean, these are words like at the time of the intransigent Cold War. This is unbelievable that this happened. How do you stop an idea if it isn't stopping the brains that have those ideas? This is very dangerous. This is very dangerous. So, what is happening in Venezuela? Again, I come back. They want to control these natural resources, especially oil and gold, and they want to stop any government in Venezuela, in Latin America, that does not toe the corporate line, the United States the corporate line. It is not a coup d'etat, what we are seeing. It is a war, a neo-colonial war. They want to make us in Latin America a colony, again, of the United States.
John Bolton, he's the Trump-appointed National Security Advisor for the United States. He has said explicitly, and I'm just going to read his quote, "It will make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela." But the bigger part that I think gives us a signal, Guaido, who the United States is now acknowledging as the president, has announced that if given the chance, he will be, and I'm quoting again, opening up Venezuela's vast oil sector to private investment and privatizing the assets held by state enterprises.
No. You know, the ambassador of Venezuela to the Organization of American States said something very profound. He said, "It is not true that the United States is behind this coup d'etat. It is in front of this coup d'etat. It is leading this coup d'etat. It is no longer the sort of masks of we're doing this for democracy, or we're doing this for the Venezuelan people, or we're doing this for liberty. We're doing this because we want their oil." Now, the funny thing about Guaido, who is such a, I'm sorry, but he's a mentally challenged individual, is that in Venezuela, the exploitation of petroleum is in concessions that are public and private. The thing is that the state has to own 50+1 of the shares. And there are many companies there who are perfectly happy with this. So it's not as if private industry is not there. But what they really want is a carte blanche. that can never be unless they change the constitution, because for quite some time the natural resources of Venezuela belong to the state, belong to the people. But this is a blatant grab. It's already started. It's a looting. It is a savage stealing of a country. What have they done to the PDVSA, the oil company's assets in the United States, and Citgo, who is the gasoline company of Venezuela and the United States? They have taken over their assets. They have stolen $30 billion worth of assets from Venezuela that belongs to them. Private property is supposed to be a tenet of capitalism, but when it comes to a country they don't like, they have stolen this. They have stolen this money, and they have stolen Venezuela's gold in the Bank of England, $1.2 billion worth of gold.
So
this is a grab.
Clearly the assets.
This is a looting of Venezuela.
Clearly, that's part of it. But
yeah.
I'm going by Guaido's comment then. By privatizing those assets, is not the United States and the associated countries, including Canada, then not pushing more, not so much even for their control of the oil fields, their control of the production facilities, but to reestablish a normal class relationship, that it should be the elite classes managing this and not a general state operation. Of
course, they're completely worried and disdainful of true democracy. Why do they keep saying that Maduro is a dictator? Because they don't want to see the reality in front of them, that it is a vital democracy. Forget socialism. What you see in Venezuela is a vital democracy. There have been 20 years of Bolivarian government. There have been 25 elections of different levels, of which the government has lost 3. Now, if you're a dictator, you're going to lose 3 elections? I don't think so. So this vibrant country, peoples who know what it is to march on the street, to go and vote, know that it is their democracy which is at stake here. I will tell you, when they were voting for the Constitutional Assembly, this Voluntad Popular, along with the United States, was out on the streets shooting, terrorism of every sort, as I said, burning people.
This is the opposition party.
The opposition party. This was, and we had here in Canada pictures of these young men with their faces covered, throwing Molotov cocktails, and with the freedom fighters of Venezuela. Just try and do this here. Try and do this here, and you'll see you'd go straight to jail. Well, when this happened, people in Venezuela went out to vote, even though they were at risk and they were being threatened. There's a whole town that the paramilitaries were there shooting, and they came out of the town through the back and crossed 2 rivers to get to the other town so that they could vote.
Now, you talk about the Constituent Assembly, and it reminds me of another question to ask you, that a lot has been said about the role of basic racism in the Venezuelan conflict. What kind of a role is the racist attitudes playing?
Look, it's always been there. It's always been there. The upper class, from time immemorial, even though they're not white, they consider themselves white. Some of them are white, but some of them are wannabe whites.
Can we just put the picture up for the last segment here? We'll just the Constituent Assembly.
Look at that.
Is the top pictures of the Constituent Assembly elected, dominated by the Chavistas.
Well,
and the picture below is the coup makers in the legislature. And what's the difference?
The difference is that is the elite, and it's white. And that is the people up there. And you can see that they are multicolored. Now, this has always been. When Chavez was elected, I was here in Canada, and I received a whole lot of emails from people I thought I knew. And they had the grossest expressions and jokes about Chavez, who looked like a gardener.
Okay, we're going to wrap this up right now. In
Yeah.
fact, I want to come back. I've got some of the cartoons from that. Yeah. We'll come back after break. Stay with us on Politically Speaking. I'm Dave Szollosy, your host on Politically Speaking. Thank you for staying with us. We're talking about Venezuela tonight. And when we ended last segment, we were just talking about some of the roles that racism plays in the conflict. And Maria, you were addressing the jokes, the images, the cartoons against Chavez himself personally and Maduro.
Yes.
Can we see that one cartoon from the Venezuelan press? Yeah, where Chavez is often been referred to as that monkey and drawn as an ape in it. Is this typical of what we're seeing?
Absolutely typical of what was happening when he was elected, and it continues to be in the social media. The things that they said about Chavez, the things they say about Maduro, because their skin was dark, because Chavez was what's called a sambo, which was he was a mix of indigenous and black. And the elite, this elite that ruled Venezuela for 40 years and who thinks themselves, descendants of the conquistadores, despise their own people. During these years that they governed, you never heard of the recognition of the culture of the Afro-Venezuelans. You never heard of the recognition for our wonderful indigenous peoples who were invisible. Nobody even knew about them, didn't even know what to call them. And now, one of the things that impressed me most, one of the first times I went back to Venezuela, that Chavez was there, the Constitution had just come out. And he went like this on the TV. This is the Constitution. And when it was zeroed in, it was in letters that I didn't understand. They wrote the Constitution in every one of the languages of the indigenous people.
Oh, right.
And some of the indigenous peoples didn't have the alphabet, so they had to figure it out with some of the linguists and whatever, and they wrote the Constitution of Venezuela in the language of the indigenous peoples. The recognition that they have, there's a ministry for them, but which is run by them. It isn't some sort of lackey who's running it. Their lands are recognized, their culture, their religions, before they were invisible. The Afro-Venezuelans, we have communities of what we call cimarrones. These were the blacks who escaped from the plantations and created their own little communities deep in the sort of, woods. Well, their descendants are there. They have special songs, special instruments, special culture that was never recognized. This is what the Bolivarian Revolution is about. It is pluralistic. It understands that Venezuela isn't just one type of people, but a whole plural ethnicities that are there. That's the wonder of this revolution, which is one of the parts as a sociologist that I love the most. There was one day someone came back from Venezuela, said to me, well, what is this is happening that I saw indigenous people marching on the streets of Caracas? They were protesting something. And I said, how wonderful. How great that the indigenous people, who knows more about what they need than them, I'm glad to see that they were on the street. Do you know what would have happened 40 years ago if they had been on the street? They'd have sent the army with them, and with machetes would have sent them back to their homes. They never would have been allowed. This is the new dignity and strength that the indigenous peoples have in Venezuela. And by the way, we have had ministers who are who are of Pemones or other ethnic groups in Venezuela. So this, as a sociologist, is one of the things I love most about this. This is one of the things that the United States doesn't want to know when you see how they have treated their indigenous peoples. And I'm sorry to say that Canada isn't too far behind in this too.
Oh, we learned a lot of that from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So,
and the residential schools. And, you know, I'm sorry, but there's a lot that the North could learn from the South, basically from Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua.
So what we've got now
and Bolivia.
Is this a war?
Yes.
Is it like Chile in 1972 with Pinochet and Allende?
Oh, yes.
Nicaragua in the 1980s with the Sandinistas and the Contra?
Look, you've got Elliot Abrams there, who was the person.
Elliot Abrams now is the delegate, the American delegate responsible for human rights, I think, in Venezuela?
No, he's in charge of Venezuela. He is a war criminal. He was indicted by his own courts in the United States for his, drugs for guns of the Contras. He was in charge of the Contras. This is the type of individual that is next to Trump. The war criminal. Then we have the warmonger Bolton there also. This is a war which is called a hybrid war.
A what war?
A hybrid war. This guy Sharp wrote about the United States, about how you can carry on these wars without saying that it's a war. This is a war of recolonization that is carried on by this lunatic in the White House who has surrounded himself by warmongers and war criminals. So it is scary, but Venezuela is not Nicaragua in the 80s. Venezuela is a strong country with a people and an army who are determined that they are going to defend, not a man, not Maduro, not Chavez, but the constitution of the country. Because this constitution took this country out of the darkest dark that it lived into the light. This constitution is what consecrates the human rights of Venezuelans. This is why when they say that Maduro is a dictator, I said, well, who is more of a dictator? Maduro, who is feeding the people, who has given them public health, who has given them public education, who has eradicated, according to the United Nations, illiteracy in Venezuela, or Mr. Trump that puts Latino refugee children in cages, and that has been considered by the United Nations as a crime against humanity. Where in the United States, where every 2 days a black young man is shot at by a policeman. The United States that has the largest number of people imprisoned. No. The dictator is in the White House, and the liberator is in La Casa Amarilla in Venezuela, is in Miraflores, Venezuela. And anyone who would like to read about this, who would like to find out what is happening, I would say stop reading the newspapers, because the newspapers have prostituted themselves. I don't see real journalism anywhere in Canada or the United States, and try and read and find out what is really happening. Best of all, get on a plane and go down and see that people are not dying on the streets, that people are not dying of starvation. One of the reasons they're not dying of starvation is because the money that they have, they are pouring it into the people. They can buy a big bag of all the essential foods twice a month at subsidized prices, which is really minimal. And this, the people of Spain would love to have, the people of Greece would love to have.
You're raising an interesting point. That's something I really want us to make sure we touch on tonight too, because a great deal is being made of the the horrible humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. That the people are suffering. They have lack of access to food, nutritious food, lack of access to medications, so much so that we've got to have an emergency relief. I noticed Roger Walters, former lead guitarist for The Who, has just condemned Richard Branson's campaign of having a concert to raise money for Nicaragua. Yeah. Because aid's not needed.
For Venezuela, yeah.
And now we see very confusing reports from the CBC who are contradicting themselves, saying, okay, our report about the blockading the bridge to stop aid wasn't a true story.
No.
CBC is saying. They're criticizing their own reporting. Yet we see the standoff right now between United States wanting to provide aid, and Guaido saying, I will get aid into the country, and the media is condemning Maduro for saying that he's preventing aid from getting in. What is going on with that question?
If you have the memory to remember, there was a humanitarian crisis in Iraq. There was a humanitarian crisis in Yugoslavia. There was a humanitarian crisis in Somalia. There was a humanitarian crisis in Libya. All those humanitarian crises, okay, where the United States and their military went in, ended in the sheer disaster for those countries. They were bombed to hell and back again, and the United States took over. This humanitarian crisis, supposedly, is a media bluff. It is a trick. It is a montage. It is a manipulation. It is the way that they have to try and bring in the military into Venezuela. Don't take my word for it. The Red Cross International has said we will have nothing to do with this because this is not a humanitarian crisis. In a real humanitarian crisis, the recipient country has to ask for it, has to formally ask, has to invite us in. Second of all, it cannot be associated in any way with anything military, let alone military threats. And what have they said about this? Let this aid in or we will invade. This is what the United States has said. It is an excuse to try to bring their soldiers and the Colombian soldiers and provoke an incident in the border so then they can say, okay, now we have to go in. So they've done this in these other countries. What is there to believe that the United States is going to go out and help anybody humanitarian? Why aren't they helping Puerto Rico? Why aren't they helping California? Why aren't they helping Haiti, which is in a terrible situation? Why aren't they helping Yemen? Yemen, the United States has said, has a bona fide humanitarian crisis of hunger. What? Because the United States isn't out there to help humanity. It's out there to conquer.
What about the reports that have been verified by the UN of so many Venezuelans leaving the country as refugees, migrating across to different South American countries around?
Well, it's funny because they're not worried about the people who leave in other countries, in Ecuador and Bolivia and Mexico. Many people are leaving and nobody cares, right? But now this is happening in Venezuela. First of all,
I think Trump does care. He's putting up a wall to prevent them from coming to the United States.
Sorry. Yes, he has to keep out all these rapists and murderers and whatnot. So anyway, in Venezuela, the upper classes are leaving. They are rich. They've got money. They've got money to pay for an airline ticket. They've got connections. I wish they would all leave. Go and live in Miami, these people. But what happened recently was that there was a campaign by the countries who are on the right. Brazil, Colombia, Peru, telling people, come. They didn't say it officially, but they were their agents. And so a lot of really lower class people, I hate to say lower class, but people who have less money, went thinking because they were told, oh, you can get jobs there.
Yeah,
Wow.
people economically marginalized.
Yes,
People, yeah.
economically marginalized. They arrive in Colombia, they arrive in Peru, they arrive in Brazil, they arrive and they realize there are no jobs there for them. They're foreigners. They can't even work there. They ended up in the street, really suffering. So what did the government do? Realizing the situation that these poor people who were duped, it established a program where any Venezuelan who wanted to return home, all they had to do was go to a consulate, and they sent in planes, and already about 800,000 Venezuelans have come back.
Okay, we're going to have to break on that note, and we'll stay with us, please, for our last segment, looking at Venezuela. We want to look at what Canada's involvement is here. Stay with us. Thank you very much. Hi, welcome back to Politically Speaking, Insights and Issues. I'm your host, Dave Szollosy. Thank you for staying with us. I'm speaking with Dr. Paez Victor about the situation in Venezuela. And in this segment, I'd like to understand what Canada's role is in this whole conflict, particularly around the founding of the Lima Group. Maybe that would be the best question to start with, please, Maria. Well, what is the Lima Group and what is their goal?
Well, the Lima Group is a self-appointed group of disgruntled right-wing governments who were not able to get the Organization of American States to condemn Venezuela, to actually approve the military intervention in Venezuela. When they couldn't get the votes in the OAS, they formed
OAS, Organization
of American States. And they formed this little group, Lima Group. And guess who leads it?
Canada.
Yeah. Canada's foreign policy has been hijacked by Minister Freeland.
That's Chrystia Freeland, our Minister of External Affairs.
Yes, she of the Cold War mentality. Well, who has Canada aligned itself with? It's aligned itself with the government of Colombia, which is the leading world producer of cocaine, the country where it is the most dangerous country to be a union leader or a community leader because you get assassinated, a country that is riddled with paramilitary crimes of every sort, a government that has had a civil war for 60 years with its own people. It has aligned itself with Peru. The last 6 presidents of Peru are either in jail or exile for corruption. And the present president of Peru was never elected. Honduras, whose government is there because of a coup d'etat 9 years ago, abetted and celebrated by the United States and Canada.
Well, in fact, Stephen Harper was the first government to recognize the military coup that took place, the government formed by that military coup.
In Honduras. Since that coup, 51,000 people have been assassinated, according to the United Nations Human Rights Department. And these are young men from 14 to 30.
I just want to be clear on that number. You said 51,000.
51,000 have been killed since the coup. Then we have Guyana. Guyana is the poorest country of the mainland, a very poor country, which has been in the jaws of ExxonMobil. These are the governments that Canada has aligned itself with. A self-appointed, failed group who could not get, the Organization of American States to go against Venezuela.
So, and Chrystia Freeland has taken a large leadership role in this, as bringing Canada in the forefront of expediting this war action against Venezuela. Why? Why Canada?
Because there was a quid pro quo with respect to the trade union, the trade deal with the United States. That trade deal with the United States, one of the things that was unsaid was, you're going to lead the charge against the economy of Venezuela so we can bring it down. And when you do our dirty work, we're going to be good to you with the trade, the NAFTA trade. This is the selling of Canadian values. Canada has always had an attitude of balanced engagement with other countries. Lester B. Pearson practically created the United Nations.
Peacekeeping forces.
The peacekeeping forces, the peacekeeping exercises that Canada has done. Pierre Trudeau, in the most terrible time of the Cold War, with tremendous pressure on him, refused to break with Cuba or China because he said Canada has an independent foreign policy. Jean Chrétien, the tremendous pressure that was put on him so that Canada would go into the horrible adventure of invading Iraq. And he refused to do this because his own intelligence people had told him there are no weapons of mass destruction. And Jean Chrétien stood up to the Americans.
Which we now know was the true case.
Unfortunately, what we have now is Trudeau Jr., who is in the hands of a Cold War warrioress, do you call her, Freeland, who is leading this charge against the most progressive countries in this hemisphere.
So how should Canada be responding?
I would demand the resignation of Krista Freeland, who has done the international reputation of this grand country a great disservice. This is not Canada, what she is doing. Maybe it's Ukraine, where she comes from, but this is not our Canada. Our Canada, who has stood for an independent, balanced view, who has been a peacemaker and now is a warmonger. And let me tell you something, David. The most important thing above anything else is peace in Venezuela.
Okay, and that's going to be what we're going to have to finish it up on.
Yes.
And we struggle for peace in Venezuela, pressuring the Canadian government to change its posture. I think we've had the website up of please name the organization again.
The Canadian, Latin American, and Caribbean Policy Center.
Okay.
CALC.
So we can get more information from the website. Please look into it. Please research. Take a look at your book, Liberty or Death. And join us. Thank you for joining us here on Politically Speaking, Insights and Issues.
Thank you
Maria,
so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
I really appreciate it.
Really appreciate the pleasure. We can go on and on with this.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. It's Dave Szollosy. Stay tuned for our next show, too.